we'll be taking a look at the null object, how to group objects in Cinema 4D, and also the layer system in Cinema 4D. Now, what is a null object? A null object is simply an empty object. When you come to the object window, the first one here is the null object. So let's create a null object. You see that when you look at the object hierarchy or the object list column, the null object is created, but when you look at our scene, there's nothing there. There's nothing there in our viewport. This simply means that the null object is an empty object. An empty object. Now, we mostly use null object to group objects together. So let's say we have a cube and a sphere, like this. We have the null object here. So let's click and drag the cube into the null object here, also the sphere into the null object here. Now we've grouped these two objects inside this null object. Now these two objects are child or our children objects, and the null object is now the parent object. So when we select the null object and move it, you see that all the objects inside it, all the child objects inside the null object moves. Okay, they move. But when you select a child object and move it, it moves alone. But if you select the null object, that is the parent object, it moves all the child objects together. This is how to group objects in Cinema 4D using the null object. Now let's talk about layer system. You can also use layer systems to somehow group objects, but you cannot actually move those objects. Okay, when you look at the object hierarchy window here, or the object list column here, you see there's this icon next to all the objects in our list. Now the first one is what we call the layers. When you click it, the menu will come for you to add a layer, and by default you have no layers, but I have two layers here. So let me delete those layers. And then we'll create a new layer and assign each of these objects to it. So to create a new layer, by default you will be inside the attributes manager. Right next to it there's a tab called layers, so select those tabs, and then to create a new layer you simply click on the add button here, the new layer button here. When you click it, a layer is there. You can double click on the name and change the name to any name that you want. So we have layers. So right now when I come to the object hierarchy or the object list, when I click on that layer icon, there's an option to add it to the layer I just created. So let's say I add the sphere to the box. You see that the icon has changed to the layer color here. Okay. So now when I come to the layer and solo it, I will only view the object inside my layer. Let me unsolo it. So this is also another way to group objects, but unlike the object where we put all the objects inside a null object, you can move this null object because it is the parent and these are the children objects. You can move them, but when you group them by layers, okay, layers, you can't move a layer because there's no control for layer. It's just putting the objects in a layer, in layers, so that you can actually view, solo, render only that layer, or do specific layer stuff with it. So that is the object grouping and the null objects in Cinema 4D.